Welcome to Tech Notice. Time to talk about this little PC here. So this is the Intel NUC 12 Extreme, or the Dragon Canyon NUC. I've used it now for about 4 weeks, different things. I've edited on this, and this is kind of my user review of this NUC. I'm also going to be comparing the benchmarks to my personal editing rig over there that's about, I don't know, 6 times the size, massive large tower, to see if this small form factor PC can actually keep up with a big tower.
Motion Array is a fantastic tool for creators to make better videos and faster.
Motion Array has over 600,000
premium quality templates, presets, plugins, music and sound effects, stock video and photos. In a nutshell, it is a one-stop shop for all your video post-production needs. Configure the membership to suit your needs. Pay annually, monthly, cancel anytime you want, and enjoy your unlimited downloads. Not sure about Motion Array? Go try out the hundreds of free assets available on the website. Check out Motion Array in the video description below.
Now then, I'm not gonna go too much in detail about the nitty-gritty of this, of the design and how to pull it apart and what's inside and so on. If you wanna see that, go check out the NUC 12 unboxing and teardown and so on. So where we talk about like what specs does it have, what's inside, how's it configured, how can you open it up and so on. Very interesting video, go check it out. But I'd like to start with some benchmarks just so that we're on the same page. Where does this guy over here line up with like my editing rig, like my personal rig, and how powerful this really is. So my personal editing rig, if you haven't seen that video either, is a Ryzen 9 5950X. I recently upgraded a few parts. The kind of core things of the performance really stays the same, just a little bit the outside got upgraded. But we're running the Ryzen 9 3950X, which is a 16 core and 20 thread processor. This NUC 12 over here has the Intel i9 12900, which is 16 core 24 thread processor. So we've got 8 performance cores and 8 efficiency cores. The CPU TDP for the Ryzen 3950X is 105 watts, and this NUC 12900 has 65 watt TDP. But both of the processors actually boost higher than their actual, average TDP, but somewhere around there is what the processors will run at. My personal rig has 64 gigabytes of RAM. That's 4 16GB sticks of 3600 MHz CL16 DDR4. This NUC over here has 2 times 32 gigabytes 3200 MHz CL20 RAM. So they both have the same capacity. The personal rig has a little bit of a better kind of spec RAM though. The cooler from my personal rig is a 420mm Arctic liquid freezer 2, and this guy over here is running just like an air cooler, small fan inside the NUC compute unit. So completely different, much smaller. The GPU for my personal rig is the NVIDIA RTX 3070 Founders Edition, whereas this one over here has the Gigabyte RTX 3070 Eagle version. So basically the same spec, really just different types of graphics cards. So my PC form factor is large case. This is the Be Quiet Silent Base 802, which is a very large case. You can fit like a lot of things in there. But this over here is very small, like very small form factor PC, super small. In terms of the iGPU, this one over here has an iGPU as well, which is the UHD 770, but my personal rig doesn't have the iGPU. In terms of the cost of both of these two builds, this guy over here, with all the specs that I have inside, comes in roughly about $3,160, where you can buy like the bare bones version of this and then add the GPU, RAM, and SSDs inside. If you want to configure like the RAM and SSD and the GPU like from the actual buyer, like Simple NUC, if you want to buy it from there, then it's a little bit more expensive. So if you are a DIY guy and you know how to do this, I highly recommend you buying these GPUs and parts separately, just because you're gonna get them for a cheaper price. But if you just want the whole package to kind of come together, you can buy it from there. It's no problem, just a little bit more expensive price. But my personal rig comes in roughly about $3,050. So basically the price difference between these two is only about $100 at maximum or something like that. Now they could be even closer if you're looking for deals here and there, and my personal rig has a lot of upgrade paths, so some of the components aren't like the best bang for this configuration, but really thinking about the future. For example, power supply is a little bit over-spec'd and the cooling is a little bit over-spec'd, and even the motherboard, but basically that's where we're standing at. Let's have a look at the benchmarks then. First of all, Cinebench R23. The NUC is about 34.7% faster in the single core speeds, but about 27.1% slower in the multi-core speeds. And this is the trend that you're going to see in all of these benchmarks, that when we look at the long rendering things like Blender or V-Ray or something that you need like long exports or rendering of the CPU, then obviously the CPU is much weaker because it boils down the TDP to 65 watts just to kind of maintain the heat and actually keep up with the performance of this, whereas my personal rig can just run that 135 something watts all the time, all day, no problem, runs super cool. In Geekbench 5, the NUC is about 27.5% faster in the single core speeds, but the multi-core speeds is only about 5% slower now, and that's because the Geekbench benchmark doesn't actually count the threads of the cores. But now that's interesting, because if you look at the cores, the 16 cores of the NUC and 16 cores of my personal rig, which means that the cores on both of these CPUs are very, very similar. Looking at Blender now, the NUC is about 29% slower in the monster scene, about 39% slower in the junk shop scene, and about 39% slower also in the classroom scene. Looking at Photoshop performance, this is amazing here. The NUC is about 38% faster in the overall score than my personal rig. And I think this is a lot to do with the single core performance, which is very, very fascinating. I do want to mention that the benchmark of my personal rig for this Photoshop is actually made with earlier version of Photoshop. It's a little bit older, a little bit some time ago when I made that benchmark score. So I suspect that if I put the newer Photoshop there as well, I'd probably get a little bit higher score, but still not as high as this NUC, because this difference here is massive. Looking at Lightroom Classic, the NUC is about 20% faster in the overall score and about 28% faster in the active score. So the active score is when you're actually working with photos, and that's where the single core performance really shines. And the passive score is still 14% faster than my personal rig. So even at the multi-core performance where you're exporting the photos, the NUC is still faster. Moving on to video editing and Premiere Pro, the overall score is 16% better on the NUC and about 15% better in the standard overall score. So very, very good scores here. The biggest difference here is the extended live playback score and the standard live playback score, where the NUC is 34 and 38% faster, and that's because of the iGPU inside. Here on the screen you can see the After Effects performance difference as well if you're interested. But in Davinci Resolve, interestingly now, my personal rig is about 1.5% faster than this NUC. That's in the extended overall score. But in the standard overall score, the NUC is still about 8% faster. Obviously, Fusion score is much faster because Fusion likes like the single core performance and so on. But generally, if we're looking at the high-end media like 8K and so on, then my personal rig is probably a little bit better there, where we can really just shine with those 16 performance scores. But standard media, where we do H.264 and 5 in 4K, I think this NUC is still better, especially in H.265 codecs, where the iGPU can really shine in the video editing there. In V-Ray, the NUC is 32% slower compared to my personal rig. So generally, I think the NUC is actually beating my personal rig in almost every single creative applications apart from rendering. Whenever you put anything rendering on, so whether it's Blender, V-Ray, Maya, any rendering multi-core score, then my personal rig is still better, just because it can just push so much more power through those 16 performance cores. But at the same time, this NUC is much more efficient in all of the tasks while performing better in video and Photoshop applications. Because of this CPU inside there that is so efficient in idling or semi kind of utilized applications, where efficiency cores can take actually most of the load and be be very, very efficient and only use the performance cores when we really need them. So that is absolutely fantastic in terms of the heat production and just keeping this machine much more efficient. So if you look at the power draw, this guy is much more efficient. So now my personal experience, what are some of the good sides and the bad sides of this little NUC guy over here? I am super happy about the form factor. Like, it's so small, you can fit it anywhere on the desk, and it's even like kind of semi-portable. If you need to take this somewhere, you can take it with you. It's fantastic. Also, it is super powerful, especially with video editing. If you're doing any like mirrorless camera editing on the timeline, this guy is much, much better just because of the iGPU inside, and the experience is much smoother, which I just like a lot. And I had no problem editing any of my videos on this one. A big thing about this also is the upgrade path. Like, this is just not like you buy it once and in a few years it might be slow and you can't upgrade anything. Like, you can upgrade pretty much everything inside here. You have a PCIe 5 16 slot over there, so even the next gen graphics cards that come out, they can go on this platform here because they're supported, which is fantastic. Secondly, the compute unit in there, in theory, you can actually even change the compute unit. So basically the motherboard, CPU, RAM, and the 2 slots, all of this guy can come out and you can put a new guy in there. It's completely possible, which is fantastic and gives you a lot of future upgradability when, you know, Intel releases the new NUC compute unit. You just put the 12 or 13900 in there, which would be insane. Now, I don't know if this is quite supported or if Intel has released any information about that, but it is possible in theory. As a creator, I am super happy about the ports of this little guy over here. We have an SD card slot in there, USB-C and USB Type-A ports in the front, and they're super fast. USB Type-A port is actually slow, that's like USB 2.0 speeds, but the SD card reader is UHS 2 speeds, so I can get super fast transfers of any of my cards. Unfortunately, my V90 card that can transfer like 300 plus megabytes or something like that is still in the RMA process, and I didn't have it here, but the V60 cards easily transferred about 250 megabytes per second. Super fast. In the back, we have every single port you want. We have Thunderbolt ports, so that gives you expandability of, you know, put a display out there. You can expand storage. So much option just because you have 2 Thunderbolt 4 ports there, plus 10 gigabit and 2.5 gigabit LAN. This is absolutely amazing. And last thing is the quietness. It's very quiet. It's not going to whiz around. If you get any of the Windows laptops or something like that, they're going to be much louder than this guy, unless you like rendering and put them head to head really. But it's actually very, very quiet. Now you're wondering how quiet it is. Can you give me a measurement? The measurements are always very hard to do without having a controlled environment because there's a lot of kind of leakage of noises depending even the time of day you're filming this. But it's not quite as quiet as Apple, like Apple Quiet, you know, Mac Minis or Mac Studio, something like that. It's not quite that quiet, but in terms of Windows PCs, it's very quiet. And if you're coming from Windows, you don't really need to worry about that. Let's talk about some of the downsides now, some things that maybe you need to worry about or think about. First of all, I don't really like the skull in the front of the device. Now, I have turned it off, as you can see over here, but there is some RGB that you can configure underneath. It's kind of like the Fast and Furious style car, you know, lower glow, which is quite cool. I like that, but I'm not a big fan of the skull in the front over there. I just more like the design and shapes and something like that, but skull, not a big fan. Second thing is the performance kind of quirk or just kind of personality of this PC, which is that if you want to do some long-term rendering or some very extended use of this PC, then it's going to start to lose performance just because it can't push itself to that 220 watts, you know, limited power draw, because it pushes there a little bit and then comes back to 65 watts, pushes there and comes back. But when I'm running my benchmarks, I had to run like a lot of benchmarks with this, much more than usually. Usually I do 3, 4 and I can see a pattern. With this one, I had to run about 7, 10 benchmarks and then seeing the pattern. But basically what I found out is that if I run a benchmark back to back to back to back, basically the benchmark score always goes lower, 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 and then kind of starts about 15-20% slower, kind of mingles around there. but I didn't calculate that. I just looked at the like highest scores, like highest average one. But basically what that tells me is that if you are using this extensively in a very warm environment, the heat of the environment actually impacts the performance of this PC. So it will lose a little bit of performance if you are in a hot environment and just absolutely hammering this in video editing or exporting or something like that. It will dip in performance. Just something to note, because it's so small and it can't quite manage all the power it wants to put through. But if you're in a cold environment, somewhere in Canada in the winter, you're gonna love it. And the last kind of downside is the price, but it's a little bit of a, love and hate kind of relationship with the price, because it is quite expensive. You think, flipping heck, $3,000 for this. I could actually get a PC with much better specs than this. And you're absolutely right. You could get something built yourself and you could get something a little bit cheaper. But at the same time, if you want to build this small form factor PC with that type of performance, you can't find really anything on the market. Even if you build it yourself, you're really going to struggle with the price and the specs to match every single spec that you have in this PC. So it's kind of a unique place where the price might look expensive if you are not bothered about the small form factor, but at the same time, if you do want the small form factor, the price is absolutely amazing. So then, that's my conclusion about this. I'm absolutely loving this and I can't wait to see where Intel takes this further. Do I recommend this for the creators? Absolutely, I do. I think this is a fantastic PC for someone who wants a small thing on the desk but still have all of the power for photo and video editing. Absolutely amazing. If you want to pick this up, I'm going to try to leave some links in the description below. Thanks guys for watching. Likes if you enjoyed it, subs if you'd like to see more, and I'll see you soon. Bye bye.